Was Hunter a tragic character? Tragic person?
Well, some people see it that way. I mean, I suppose at the end, whenever anybody commits suicide, it's a tragedy. And he's a tragic character in the sense that I think he was, his own tragic flaws did lead to his downfall. But I think he's a joyful and inspirational character in many ways because he was so full of life. He was a kind of a natural seducer, and he was just one of those people who lit up the room. And you want to celebrate people like that.
What was it like working with Johnny Depp? Because he knew Hunter.
Johnny Depp knew Hunter, and not only that, but he went and lived with Hunter. There's a small garret-like room in the basement of Hunter's house in Woody Creek, Colorado, that is called Johnny's room. It's just a thin cot-like bed there and a slit of a window, and that's where Johnny lived for a number of weeks as he shadowed Hunter. I mean, he shaved his head. He started smoking a cigarette through the cigarette holder. He did everything that Hunter did, and I think that made a powerful impression on him. I mean, I think Johnny was really taken by Hunter, and when I say taken, I mean as an actor, he was literally taken over by him because he had to inhabit Hunter. He really, really did a pretty thorough job of doing that. So I think he's always been fascinated with Hunter. You'll see that he, does the introductions to a lot of his books. And so to me, and it took a long time to work it out, but to me he was the only person to do the narration because the narration is only Hunter Thompson's words. There's no other narration except for Hunter Thompson's words. So it was key that Johnny do it.
What was your initial reaction when you heard that Hunter committed suicide?
Well, I mean, I hadn't even started the project then. To me, it was a bit of distant thunder. And I'd certainly read his big books when I was in college. But I hadn't thought about Hunter in a long time. But after he committed suicide, Frank Rich wrote a very interesting piece in the New York Times that made me want to go and reinvestigate him. And some people came forward, indeed, and offered me the chance to do the film. So, it was then I started to think about him a lot.
Do you think he's someone you respect, look up to, even?
I definitely respect Hunter. I mean, this guy's a master. I mean, he was a great, great writer, and a very, very funny writer. As a person, look, particularly toward the end of his life, I don't know if I would have gotten along with him or not. But as a writer, I respect him tremendously. He's a giant.
Now, I do want to talk about Taxi to the Dark Side. What were you hoping to uncover with this film? I mean, now that's a tragic film. If you want to talk about tragedy, I think.
Well, Taxi to the Dark Side looks at the dark side of the American character, and indeed how it was corrupted, how our character was corrupted by a few officials in the Bush administration who decided, in their anger and I suspect their fear after the attack on 9/11, that they were going to change things and that the gloves were going to come off. And suddenly they were going to approve, harsh interrogation techniques that had previously been forbidden. And what you discovered was that they set loose furies. It was almost like opening the Pandora's box of depravity. And they thought that was going to stand them in good stead, but what it did instead was to corrupt us all. And so that's what I wanted to make the film about. More particularly, the film is about looks at a story that I read about in the New York Times about a young Afghan taxicab driver named Dilawar who was taking a few passengers home to his small village near Afghanistan, and he was apprehended by Afghan militia, turned over to American forces who took him to Bagram prison in Afghanistan. And after a 5-day interrogation, he was dead. The Army initially said he died from natural causes, but an investigation by a very skilled New York Times reporter named Carlotta Gall discovered that, in fact, he had been beaten to death. And indeed, another detainee just a week before had also died in similar circumstances. So this caused, when it was finally uncovered, and even more so after Abu Ghraib, when people wanted to hold a few bad apples accountable, the Army began to investigate. But what's interesting about his story is that by following his story, you can see just, you can see the dark end to which this kind of policy of mistreatment and cruelty leads. So it was a haunting story.
Where did it lead exactly?
Well, in a very tangible and concrete way, it led a few places. The very people who interrogated Dilawar and so brutal toward him were, some of them rewarded, some of them promoted, and sent to their new assignment, Abu Ghraib. This is before we knew about the Abu Ghraib scandals, and they set some of the interrogation policies at Abu Ghraib, which went way beyond normie Army field manual stuff. So that part of the story is interesting because you begin to realize, oh yes, Abu Ghraib was not a few bad apples. It was a systemic problem, and Abu Ghraib just became a kind of symptom of what was a bigger problem. The other thing that happened in a concrete way was that the 3 passengers in Dilawar's taxi were shipped off to Guantanamo. Now, they were shipped off at a time when they knew Dilawar was innocent. But somehow, and nobody said so on the record, but I pretty strongly suspect that they were shipped off to Guantanamo to cover up the fact that they had killed an innocent man. And this shows the kind of corruption of the system. You send innocent people off to Guantanamo for 15 months for no good reason. Why? Because it helps you to cover up a mistake. It makes it look like there was really a conspiracy and that these guys were really the worst of the worst. And in fact, nothing of the sort. And that's the other trail in my film, which looks at how we destroyed this fundamental principle of habeas corpus, and we shipped a lot of people to places like Guantanamo who were innocent. Now, there are a lot of bad guys there, but there are many people there who shouldn't have been there. And only 7% of the people in Guantanamo, at least in 2004, were actually picked up by American forces. So, in a concrete way, those are 2 places that the Dilawar story leads. I think in a broader spiritual sense, the Dilawar story shows the damage that is done when you do, as Dick Cheney urged us to do, go over to the dark side. That's what he said, literally, on Meet the Press to Tim Russert. He said, we're going to have to go over to the dark side.
What sort of torture did Dilawar endure?
Well, the fact was that he was roughed up by his interrogators to some extent, but I think the damage done was mostly by the MPs who were in his care. At first, they were trying to keep him awake, and they didn't have enough people to do it. And that was a technique, sleep deprivation, to help soften him up for interrogation. So they literally hung him with handcuffs from the ceiling of his isolation cell. Now that caused blood to flow to his legs, and it can also be very painful if you have to stand, upright for a long period of time. But in any case, it caused a lot of blood to flow to his legs. Then the one control measure on the one day of training that some of these MPs had was a thing called the perennial strike, which was a knee to an area in the thigh, which is supposed to control people very quickly. They crumple. Well, they were using that strike technique on Dilawar over and over and over again, even though he was shackled, even though he was hooded. And sometimes it got out of hand. So the cause of his death ultimately was that his legs, according to the Army coroner, were pulpified. And he died of a pulmonary embolism as a result.